You're sitting in traffic. Again, a river of red taillights flows to the horizon, and you haven't moved in 5 minutes. The engine hums, the radio drones on, and outside your window is a landscape built for this exact moment. 6 lanes of asphalt, sprawling parking lots, and buildings you can't possibly walk between. This is the reality of the American city. It's a machine designed for the car, and we are just ghosts within it. We accept this as normal, as the inevitable result of progress. We tell ourselves that people simply chose the freedom of the automobile over the clunky, outdated streetcar. But sometimes, after a heavy rain, you can still see them, the ghosts of a different future. Iron rails, buried for decades, peeking through a crack in the asphalt, a silent reminder that nearly every American city once had a sophisticated, walkable, electric transit network. A network that didn't just disappear, it was dismantled. So how did this happen? Was our car-centric world an accident, a simple matter of consumer choice? Or was it the result of a calculated, deliberate strategy, executed by a handful of powerful men who saw the future not as a public good, but as a captive market? To understand why your city looks the way it does, you have to understand a forgotten federal court case from 1949. This is the story of that case, and the real crime it failed to prosecute. In United States versus National City Lines, General Motors and its allies were convicted of a criminal conspiracy. But here's the twist. They weren't convicted of destroying the nation's streetcar systems. They were convicted of the much smaller crime of monopolizing the market for buses, tires, and fuel. The court treated the annihilation of America's premier public transit network as a mere side effect, an incidental footnote to a minor antitrust violation. Because the justice system prosecuted the symptom instead of the disease, it inadvertently cemented the victory. This is why our cities were permanently reshaped. We're going to trace the story back to the source, to the boardroom of the world's most powerful corporation, to the mind of the man who ran it, and to the ruthlessly effective playbook he designed. This isn't just a story about a corporate conspiracy. It's the story of how America was sold a car and traded its cities in the deal. To understand the plan, you first have to understand the man who engineered it. Alfred P. Sloan, the chairman of General Motors. The central question is simple, but confounding. Why would the world's biggest car company get into the bus business? Why would the architect of the automobile age invest in its biggest competitor, public transit? The answer reveals a strategy far more ambitious than simply killing off a rival. Sloan was not a flamboyant industrialist like Henry Ford. He was a quiet, calculating manager, an organizational strategist obsessed with control. His core belief was a business concept that sounds dull, but is ruthlessly effective: vertical integration. Vertical integration is simple. If you're a baker, don't just own the bakery. Own the flour mill and the wheat farm too. Control every step of the supply chain, from raw material to final sale. Because of Sloan, GM didn't just assemble cars. It owned the companies that made the components: the batteries, the axles, the spark plugs, the glass. This obsession with controlling the entire system is what led Sloan to look at America's streetcar network. In the 1920s and 30s, he saw a massive, chaotic industry he didn't own. Hundreds of independent transit companies ran electric streetcars built by dozens of different manufacturers, powered by local electric utilities. For a man like Sloan, this was not a threat to be eliminated. It was a market to be conquered. It was a messy, independent system that needed to be brought under his control. He realized the strategic opportunity wasn't to replace public transit with private cars, at least not at first. The far more profitable, immediate move was to replace one form of public transit with another. His form. He could replace those independent electric streetcars with GM-built buses that ran on rubber tires made by his corporate partners, powered by gasoline sold by his industrial allies. This is why the story isn't a simple case of murder. It was a calculated, hostile takeover. Alfred P. Sloan's goal wasn't to destroy public transportation. It was to force public transportation to become a permanent, dependent, and very profitable customer of General Motors. The first step was not to burn the system down, but to build a Trojan horse to get inside its walls. To execute this hostile takeover, Alfred P. Sloan needed a front. He couldn't have the General Motors name on the deed when buying up the nation's streetcar lines. The public would see the conflict of interest immediately. He needed proxies, ambitious operators who could manage the day-to-day work while he and his corporate allies pulled the strings from the shadows. This is why, in 1936, a fateful meeting took place. Sloan and his executive team met with two brothers from Minnesota, Roy and Frank Fitzgerald. The Fitzgeralds were small-time bus operators, but they had big ambitions. They were the perfect candidates to be the public face of the operations. GM, along with its partners at Standard Oil of California and Firestone Tire, provided the Fitzgeralds with millions in seed money. With that capital, the brothers formed a new company, National City Lines. This new company was a specific and powerful corporate tool, a holding company. Think of a holding company not as a business that times makes times anything, but as a corporate vessel that simply times owns times other businesses. It's a way for investors to control a vast network of companies from a distance, all under one unassuming name. For Sloan, this structure was strategically essential, created a layer of separation, a corporate firewall. When National City Lines came to a new town to buy out the local trolley system, the city council and the public saw the Fitzgerald brothers, two seemingly independent bus entrepreneurs. They didn't see the industrial giants, General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil, whose money was making the purchase possible. Because of this corporate camouflage, National City Lines began its work without raising suspicion. It was a phantom menace, quietly acquiring transit systems in cities across the Midwest and beyond, from Michigan to Illinois, Ohio to California. The Trojan horse was built. With each new city it acquired, National City Lines grew, but its true ownership remained concealed. The Fitzgeralds were presented as self-made transit magnates, a classic American success story. But what city officials and the riding public didn't know was that their local transit system was no longer a public utility. It had become a captive asset, secretly controlled by the very corporations that stood to profit from the destruction of its electric rail. The stage was now set for the second act, dismantling the systems from within. Once National City Lines, controlled by the Fitzgerald brothers, took ownership of a city's streetcar system, they executed a methodical, three-step playbook. It was a strategy designed to manufacture failure and make their predetermined solution, GM buses, seem not just preferable, but inevitable. This process is the reason why, in dozens of American cities, a once thriving transit option vanished in just a few short years. The first step was acquisition. But the second, and most critical, was neglect. Roy and Frank Fitzgerald didn't immediately start ripping up tracks. Instead, they practiced something called capital abandonment. It's a simple, but devastatingly effective strategy. You stop investing in maintenance. They let the electric streetcars get old and shabby. They deferred repairs on the tracks, making the rides slower and bumpier. They cut service frequency, making riders wait longer on the platform. This neglect was a calculated business decision. It turned the public against their own transit system. The once beloved streetcar became a symbol of urban decay, dirty, unreliable, and obsolete. The decline wasn't natural, it was engineered. This led directly to step 3, replacement. Once public frustration reached a boiling point, the Fitzgeralds would ride in with the perfect solution: a fleet of brand new, modern buses. They would make a big show of modernizing the city's transit. They tore up the steel tracks, a move that was not only expensive, but also permanent, ensuring electric rail could never easily return. Then came the final, strategic lock-in. National City Lines would force the City Transit Authority to sign exclusive dealing contracts. These legally binding agreements stipulated that for decades to come, the city could only purchase buses from General Motors. They could only buy tires from Firestone, and they could only buy fuel from Standard Oil. It was the final move in Alfred Sloan's game of vertical integration. They hadn't just sold a city a fleet of buses, they had acquired a customer for life, eliminating all competition and locking in a monopoly that would define the American commute for the next century. This calculated dismantling of city after city was proceeding with remarkable efficiency. The playbook was working. From Baltimore to Los Angeles, the pattern repeated: acquire, neglect, replace, and lock in. To the public, it looked like progress. To the architects at General Motors, it was a masterclass in market creation. What they didn't count on, however, was a retired naval lieutenant commander from New Jersey named Edwin J. Quinby. Quinby wasn't a corporate titan or a politician. He was a transit enthusiast, a man who saw the intricate beauty in an electric railway and understood precisely what was being lost. This is why the conspiracy ever came to light. It wasn't uncovered by a government agency, but by a passionate citizen who refused to believe the official story. As he watched the streetcars in his own region vanish, Quinby saw the national pattern emerging. He saw that the same companies, GM, Firestone, Standard Oil, were always behind the curtain. He didn't have access to secret boardrooms, but he had timetables, newspaper clippings, and a deep understanding of how transit systems were supposed to work. In 1946, he channeled his outrage into a 24-page pamphlet he titled, "The Case of the Stricken Trolleys." It was a meticulous, impassioned piece of whistleblowing. Quinby laid out the corporate connections, the identical methods of destruction, and the ultimate goal: to force Americans into buses and, eventually, into private cars. He printed it himself and mailed it to anyone he thought would listen: journalists, city councils, and, most consequentially, a few prosecutors at the Department of Justice. A single copy landed on the desk of a government antitrust lawyer. For the first time, someone with the power to act was looking at the blueprint. Edwin Quinby had sounded the alarm, and now the federal government was finally turning its head. Because of Quinby's pamphlet, the gears of justice began to grind. Federal investigators followed the money, and in 1947, a grand jury indicted General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil for criminal conspiracy. The trial 2 years later seemed like a David and Goliath moment. Here was the government, finally holding the world's most powerful corporations accountable for killing America's mass transit. So justice was served, right? Not exactly. Here's the problem. The prosecutors had the right culprits, but they were forced to charge them with the wrong crimes. This led directly to the hollow victory that cemented our car-dependent future. The only legal tool the government had was the Sherman Antitrust Act. Think of it like a hammer. It's a great tool for breaking up a monopoly on nail sales, but it's the wrong tool for prosecuting someone who used a hammer to tear down a house. The prosecution couldn't charge GM with the colossal act of destroying a national transportation network. Why? Because doing so wasn't technically illegal. Instead, they had to argue a much smaller, more technical point: that GM and its partners conspired to monopolize the time sale of buses and supplies to their own subsidiary companies. The verdict was a strategic and consequential failure. In 1949, the corporations were found guilty, but only on the lesser charge of monopolizing sales, not of monopolizing transit itself. The punishment was a token slap on the wrist. General Motors was fined a mere $5,000. H.C. Grossman, the treasurer who personally oversaw the operation for GM, was fined a single dollar. For less than the price of one new bus, GM had purchased the future of American transportation. The court had punished a minor infraction, while the greater, unnamed crime, the deliberate demolition of public infrastructure, was treated as a mere side effect. It was a business decision, not a public crime. This verdict sent a clear message. Gutting a city's transit for profit wasn't just possible, it was legal. The $5,000 fine wasn't just a legal failure, it was a public relations victory for General Motors. Because the verdict was so minor, it validated a narrative that GM's defenders still use today: that the streetcars were already dying. They argue that National City Lines was simply a modernizing force, a corporate hospice worker easing a decrepit, unprofitable technology into its grave. And on the surface, they had a point. By the 1930s, many streetcar systems were struggling. The Great Depression had starved them of investment, and World War II had run the existing equipment into the ground without a chance for replacement. The tracks were inflexible, unable to follow the new suburbs spreading across the landscape. But here's the problem with that story. It mistakes a temporary illness for a terminal diagnosis. This is why our cities struggle to build permanent transit today. We've inherited the belief that transit is always on the verge of collapse. The truth is, the streetcars' problems were solvable. Other countries were already modernizing their electric fleets, creating faster, quieter, and more comfortable vehicles. Cities like San Francisco and Boston proved that with investment, streetcar systems could adapt and thrive. The industry wasn't dying of old age. It was suffering from a treatable condition called deferred maintenance. What Roy Fitzgerald and National City Lines did was strategically foreclose any possibility of a cure. They didn't just buy struggling companies. They targeted healthy ones too. They used GM's capital to outbid local groups who wanted to invest in and modernize the existing electric infrastructure. Once in control, they didn't just neglect the rails, they actively tore them up, signing contracts that legally forbade any future operator from ever running a vehicle on rails in those streets again. This wasn't a mercy killing. It was a calculated corporate takeover that ensured a sick patient would never recover, all to create a captive market for their own products. So we've seen the playbook, the takeover, and the trial that punished the symptom while ignoring the disease. The conviction was a hollow victory that allowed a convenient story to take hold, that the car was simply what Americans wanted. But this outcome wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just about selling a few thousand buses. This brings us back to the architect of this entire world, Alfred P. Sloan. To understand why you're sitting in traffic today, you have to understand Sloan's true, transformative goal. His vision wasn't just to monopolize a market. It was to fundamentally change the nature of transportation itself. Sloan's entire business philosophy at General Motors was built on a concept he perfected: planned obsolescence. He knew the real money wasn't in selling someone a single, durable product that would last a lifetime. The real money was in creating a permanent replacement market, where the consumer was always in a cycle of buying, upgrading, and replacing. Electric streetcars were the enemy of this philosophy. They were a public utility, built like infrastructure. The vehicles were designed to last for 40 or 50 years. You don't replace your water pipes every 3 years. And you weren't supposed to replace your transit system either. It was durable, permanent, and worst of all for Sloan, it was a one-time sale. This is the hidden mechanism that explains our modern world. The destruction of the streetcar wasn't just about replacing a train with a bus. It was a calculated strategy to transform American transportation from a permanent public utility into a disposable consumer good. Buses were the first step. They wear out faster than streetcars. But the personal automobile was the ultimate goal. A car creates an endless cycle of replacement parts, tire sales, oil changes, and, of course, a new car every few years. Sloan's consortium didn't just kill the streetcar. They replaced a piece of the city with a product. They transformed citizens into a permanent customer base. This is why our cities look the way they do. This is why our landscape is dominated by pavement, gas stations, and parking lots. The ghost in our gridlock isn't a ghost at all. It was a choice, made in a corporate boardroom 80 years ago, to trade permanent infrastructure for permanent profit. The system isn't broken. It was built this way, on purpose, to serve a market that sees public transit as a threat and car dependency as a business model. If you found this eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history that shapes our world. And leave a comment. What would your city look like if the streetcars had survived?